Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Everybody loves our dollars. From the best-selling author of Moneyland and Butler to the World comes a new anatomy of global money laundering, the crime that makes crime pay. Here to tell us more about Everybody Loves Our Dollars is Oliver Bullough. Oliver, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for having me on the show.
Good to have you with us again. You were with us, I was going to say only a few years ago, but I looked at my records and it was 2018. So therefore...
Well, there we go. We were all younger back then.
Yes, indeed. As I say, it was BC, before coronavirus. Let's not even go there. You've written about this subject before, but it is a subject that I think we need to look at more and more. You know, people always say, oh, well, cash is king, baby. And this book, definitely, if you're in the underworld, cash seems to be king.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I suppose I wrote the first book about financial crime, I don't know, almost a decade ago. And it was just a one-off, you know. It seemed like a big issue. In fact, it was so obviously an important issue that I actually thought that the world's governments would probably sort the problem out that I was writing about before I got the book out. But that didn't happen, as it turned out. And then I read a second book about it, and now I've written a third book about it. And it turns out that actually, I'd say, if anything, the criminals are rather winning than the other way around. So, yeah, cash is king. I mean, we obviously, you know, in journalism and more broadly, we like to talk about the new sort of shiny issues, whether that's cryptocurrency or whatever. And of course, that is really important. But for the criminals, the old ways are still the best ways. And if I was laundering money in Spain right now, I would say my most useful tool would be a €200 note.
Indeed. So for those who may have heard the saying money laundering, but perhaps haven't got a grip on it, just give me sort of money laundering 101, if you could.
Well, the origin story for the term, people tend to go back to Chicago in the 1920s, you know, when Al Capone was running the mob back there, and that was when alcohol was illegal in the US, and he was supposedly making so much money from whiskey sales that he needed some way to justify his earnings. You know, he couldn't just go to the tax man and say, well, look, I've sold all this whiskey, because that was illegal. So what he supposedly did was buy a load of laundromats, as they call them over there, and you know, essentially pretended to have done a lot more laundry than he'd really done. You know, instead of washing 50 shirts in a day, they'd wash 500, and therefore they could justify all the profits. That isn't actually the origin story of the term money laundering. It's a much more recent term than that, but it does nicely describe what's going on. You've got, you know, criminals who've got a lot of, you know, profits from their criminal activities. They can't just say straight out to the authorities, you know, I've made all this money from selling cocaine, because then the authorities might have some questions. So instead, they come up with a more plausible explanation for where the money's come from. They'll say it, you know, it comes from, you know, washing shirts, or it comes from investing in property. It comes from, you know, service charges for some form of unrelated business activity somewhere else, whatever. But whatever it is, it's designed to make your money look legitimate. And it's called money laundering because you're washing the money through this machine, and when it comes out the other end, it's whiter than white.
Because we were always being told that, you know, people are saying, oh, cash is being wiped out, everything's going to be done in a car, they're going to have chips in your hand one day, etc., etc. But that's okay if you're in the first world, but, you know, for the majority of the planet, as you said, dollars are great, cash is king. So many transactions are done with hard physical cash.
I mean, it's a really interesting and strange paradox, to be honest, because all across all over the world, you know, both in the developed world and developing countries, the proportion of transactions which involve cash is falling, right? If you look at official statistics, whether they're in, you know, the UK, the US, the European Union, Australia, Canada, you know, wherever, you know, fewer and fewer people are using cash to go to the cafe, go to the shop, to pay for taxis. You know, obviously you can't buy things online with cash and so on. And yet, in all of those places, the amount of cash that's being produced by central banks is going up and up. It hits a new record high pretty much every month. I mean, the amount of euros in circulation, I mean, you know, cash euros hit a record high in December. In the UK, again, the same. In the US, it hits a record high every month. There's just no real plausible explanation for where all these cash is going, except into the criminal underworld. No one else particularly wants the money. It isn't being used by ordinary citizens, even in countries that are particularly enthusiastic about cash, like Germany and Austria. There's fewer and fewer people are still using cash there. So, essentially, we have created and as I'm sure any of your listeners who are, trying to open a bank account or to get a mortgage or to engage in any kind of business activities, there is an enormous bureaucracy around fighting, in inverted commas, fighting money laundering. It is incredibly hard to get a bank account, but it's very difficult to move money from one place to another, and all that. And so there are all these sort of boxes you need to tick, hoops you need to jump through, and all the other things. And so criminals feel all that too. So they're looking for a way to do business outside of all those checks which are happening. So that's what they use cash for. And of course the great hypocrisy and irony behind all this is that the restrictions that are being put in place to make it hard for you or me to get a bank account, are being put in place by governments, which are the same governments that are producing all this cash at the same time. So they're essentially producing the most useful tool for criminals to circumvent the very restrictions that governments place in an attempt to stop criminals. So it's a boneheaded system. It's incredibly badly designed. And I suppose the hypocrisy in it is that printing cash is incredibly profitable. If you print a 200 euro note, the profits of that is about 199 euros and about 90 euro cents. I mean, it's an incredibly profitable way of carrying on. So, governments are not just circumventing their own restrictions, they're also making a lot of money out of it.
There used to be the 500 euro note, of course, which we called the Bin Laden, because we knew they were there, but nobody had ever seen one.
Yeah, I mean, the 500 euro notes, they stopped printing them after the terrorist attacks in Paris.
Yeah.
The fact that they did that shows very clearly that they're aware that these are things used in illicit activity, that they're used in terrorist financing. If you would connect terrorist atrocity with the use of cash money, it just goes to show that it's obvious that there's a connection between these big bills and illicit activity. And yet, governments are so enthusiastic about the profits to be made, the income to be made from printing these big banknotes. I mean, in every country has an equivalent. In Switzerland, they have 1,000 franc note, incredibly, which is, worth, whatever that's, 1,000 euros right there. In the US, $100 bills. By far the most common bill, if you look at the statistics, is $100 bill. And yet in the US, you hardly ever see one. And, if you try and go into a Starbucks and pay with one, they'll just look at you. In the UK, we have a £50 note. Again, you never see them here, and yet they're, a significant proportion of all the currency in circulation. So, all governments are at it. But that's not really an excuse. I mean, just because they're all being bad, it doesn't mean that any of them should be.
And I suppose the other thing is if you've got a weakness in the chain around the world, I mean, you used to be able to, and I'm speaking to you from Marbella, where we are familiar with the concept of paying in cash for everything, including large developments, but you can't just rock up with a briefcase like you could 20 years ago and say, I want to buy a house now, and pull out, and Igor pulls out the notes. But somewhere in the world, you can do that because of corruption. And then, obviously, that can be transferred and watched, because we're not talking about somebody opening a barber shop or a shisha, on the road. We're talking about an international criminal network that's probably based somewhere with rather relaxed rules to investment. And that now, because of the networks, that is a global situation.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. This is a globalized criminal economy. The criminal economy is every bit as globalized, if not more globalized, than the formal economy. And criminals are incredibly entrepreneurial when it comes to spotting ways to move their money around, to keep their profits, to get their profits back into the formal economy so they can buy, property and cars and all of the things that everyone wants. And there are these, as it were, some problem jurisdictions. The United Arab Emirates, in particular Dubai, is a real problem. A couple of places in Central America and so on. But, really, I mean, the sort of the secret, or the not even secret, the open secret now is this rather alarming developments in the US with the Trump administration, where, for a long time, I mean, since, certainly longer than I've been alive, we've been really accustomed to the fact that the Americans are very serious about tackling financial crime. They are the most serious. They levy the biggest fines on the banks. They put people in prison for long jail terms for, white collar offenses in a way that other countries tend not to. But, since Donald Trump's return to the White House, particularly with regard to cryptocurrency, but there's been a kind of almost complete relaxation of the rules. I mean, you've probably heard of the enhanced games which are coming up in Las Vegas this year, the sort of version of the Olympics when you can take as many performance enhancing drugs as you like. That's kind of what the Trump administration is doing with cryptocurrency. And cryptocurrencies now, I mean, they're so useful for moving value around the world, for criminals to just be able to operate outside of the formal financial system, that all of the checks that we've tried to put in place to stop money laundering have just kind of fallen away. And now it's a global feeding frenzy. It's amazing.
I mean, one of the things that in a previous life, believe it or not, I was the editor of a poker magazine. This is back in the early 2000s when poker was taking over the world. There were big American online companies doing it. And the Bush administration brought in a bill because they found out that criminals were basically playing online with their mates and doing these huge bets and transferring money across the tables, knowing that they were going to lose, but that money was then washed. So they are quite inventive, and with the deregulation of the crypto markets, because, hey, beating the system, we're going to see more and more of that, aren't we?
I mean, absolutely. As far as we can tell from the analysis that the sort of blockchain analytics companies have done, who are all over this, they're very aware of what's going on. Sanctions evasion using cryptocurrency. And of course, what does sanction evasion mean? That means, the Russian government funding the war in Ukraine and so on. We're talking about, it's risen something like sevenfold just in the last year. And that's pretty alarming, to be honest. So, we've got a big problem, and it's just getting worse.
And the other problem is the fact that if you try and put legislation in here, it's moving 5 steps behind what the blockchain or the cryptocurrency geniuses are doing. So by the time you put the legislation, they've already worked out a new way. So you're always going to be behind them, aren't you?
Absolutely. There's really there's no hiding the fact that the criminals are more entrepreneurial than governments. They're cleverer than governments, and governments need to get much better at moving quickly, moving really ruthlessly to stop what they're doing.
What about this? Now, again, I'm based in Marbella. We see an awful lot of designer handbags, strange registered plated cars. We've even got sort of bartering. What's this about the eels? Tell me more.
About the what? So the eagles.
I've got eels in this on my press notes. Baby eels.
Yeah, I mean, eels are...
I've seen many things on my nights in Marbella, Oliver, but I've never seen anybody pull a baby eel out of a Gucci handbag whilst getting into their Lamborghini. Explain.
Basically, you've got to look at all criminal markets as connected. They are constantly looking for ways of moving value, of profiting, and eels are a really weird way of doing that. I'm really sorry. Something has come up. I'm going to have to go.
Fine.
I'm very, very sorry to cut you off like that. But it's suddenly realised.
Right. Fine. No problem at all. I will get you back on the future. But thank you, Oliver. Please feel free to go.
Please accept my apologies.
Apologies accepted, Oliver, very much indeed. Live radios, ladies and gentlemen. Everybody Loves Our Dollars, the new book by Oliver Bullough. I'm not sure, maybe somebody's hacked his crypto account or something like that.